other
There was
questions?
one question before that is, where does it come from?
Where does what come from? The
The
whole...
critic.
Huh?
Where does the inner critic comes from?
Oh,
How
where
to
the inner
work-
critic comes from.
and also how to work with that somatically with the inner critic.
How to... Okay, so where the inner critic comes from and how to work with the inner critic in a somatic way.
Yeah.
Is that good? So
Yeah.
2 questions. Cool. To get to the first one, I think there are 2 sources to the inner critic, and I think it's very important to know about both sources. So, well, in a way you can say there's one source, and that's your family environment. But I like to distinguish between 2 aspects of it. The one aspect is children are very smart. They know that they are kind of dependent on the adults that take care of them. And they know that it's probably a good idea not to piss them off too much. So they sort of look at, they notice what do I do when they do a lot of different things, and then they notice what brings them into conflict with their parents. And if they sort of pick up what brings them into conflict with their parents, if you're smart as a child, you try to avoid conflict with your parents. And one very good way of avoiding conflict with your parents is that if you learn to correct yourself before your parents correct you. Does that make sense? If your parents always get upset whenever you are too, let's say, too alive, if you're like too noisy, right? If that upsets your parents, then you learn to correct yourself. When the impulse to be noisy comes, you go like, oh, this is, and then you say whatever it is your parents usually say, and as a way to stop yourself from it, because then you also stop yourself from getting in conflict with your parents. It's very smart. Now, if you only think and only explore this source of the inner critic, you might get fairly upset with your parents, because it seems like all the inner critic that you are today exposed to is just them sort of like correcting you, and you go like, okay, you did copy them, but still it kind of cultivates a slight resentment. And I think that there's another way or another source which is equally important, and that is to say, you're not just shaped in your direct interaction with your parents, sort of like what is it you call it, this behavioristic, Paulo docs type thing, right? That's not the only way that you are shaped. You are also shaped in a more like social learning kind of way. If you know the experiment by Bandura with the children seeing adults beating up the clown doll Bobo, and then later when they got upset, they would beat up the clown doll. Now, they had never been rewarded for beating up the clown. They just imitated what they saw. So children also imitate their parents. And children are extremely perceptive. They're like mind readers, right? So one thing is that you're shaped in your interactions with your parents, but you're also just shaped by copying them. And your parents have inner critics. Your parents will correct themselves. And sometimes your parents will say, do something, and then they will speak out their inner critic. They will go, oh, that's stupid. Or sometimes there will also just be like a conspicuous absence of certain emotions in your parents. For example, you never saw your parents cry. That probably means that your parents would judge themselves for that. So, and I think when you explore not just how your inner critic was shaped by the sort of negative feedback you got from your parents, but also shaped by how your parents criticized themselves, usually I find that you will see a very important source of inner criticism, and also you will develop a certain level of empathy with your parents, which I think in many cases can be a good thing. Cool.